When hearing the name Insomniac Games, what's the first game series that comes to your mind? For many, it's the Ratchet & Clank series, a game series that's been going on for 20 years on PlayStation consoles that started on the PlayStation 2 and even has console iterations today on the PlayStation 5. Others, it's the Resistance series, a game series that started on the PlayStation 3, had some handheld iterations, and then kind of fizzled out after that. Others still, it's the other games that Insomniac Games have made, such as Sunset Overdrive, originally on the Xbox One, or, more famously nowadays, the Spider-Man line of games that have appeared on the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 with a new iteration coming out this fall. No, for me, one of the first game series I will always think about with Insomniac Games is the Spyro the Dragon series. Spyro the Dragon was created and developed by Insomniac Games, published by Universal Interactive Studios on the PlayStation 1 exclusively as part of a deal to bolster the PlayStation lineup, similar to how the Crash Bandicoot series got its start with Universal Interactive and Naughty Dog. The Insomniac Games Spyro the Dragon series would be made into 3 games, much like how Crash Bandicoot was given 3 games and had 1 extra game worked on in the meantime by Naughty Dog. And, much like Crash Bandicoot, once Insomniac Games left their franchise behind, it kinda went downhill in more ways than one. But we're not here to talk about that today. Today we're here to talk about the game that started it all, the 1998 original Spyro the Dragon. Spyro the Dragon is an interesting game in that it's a collectathon platformer that has you always collecting something throughout the game. Each second has you collecting gems, dragon eggs, dragons, or other collectibles inside of a level in order to progress. And it's that gameplay loop that helps to develop quite the adventure for our little purple dragon. So, we're not going to be spending too much time on the story, but we have to start somewhere, right? And I can't think of anything better than to start with Nasty Nork. Our story begins in the artisan's homeworld. A dragon giving an interview is asked questions about Nasty Nork, an individual who has been trying to take over the Dragon Realms by using stolen dragon treasure in order to create minions for his army, and thus subsequently take over the Dragon Realm. Upon hearing the name Nasty Nork, another dragon interjects and begins to insult Nasty Nork, calling him inconsequential, not a threat, and, worst of all, he calls him ugly. That's very uncalled for. As a result of these transgressions, Nasty Nork ends up casting a spell, turning all dragons into stone crystallized statues. All save for our main protagonist, Spyro, who happens to be just too short and too young to be hit by the spell. That's pretty much it. Yep, I told you the plot is very bare bones in the first Spyro the Dragon game, and that's because this is still a time where game stories weren't really put too much in the focus, save for RPGs. And so, as a result, our quest is very much laid out to us in the beginning, actually even given hints at during the interview. There are 5 dragon worlds, or is it 6, as the dragon giving the interview can't remember. And there is 12,000 treasure, or is it 14,000? These all hint at what we have to collect and have to reobtain in Spyro the Dragon in order to get full 100% completion. There isn't too much to the story, save for an extra ending once you get full 100% and another credit sequence roll. One thing I will give the Spyro Reignited trilogy, the remake of Spyro 1 added a lot more little details here and there to the Spyro 1 story. While that wasn't necessary, it's still very much appreciated. My favorite instance is the fact that in the original Spyro the Dragon, we don't know how Nasty Nork is hearing this interview, but in the remake for Reignited, it's implied he's watching the interview on a television set, and thus that's how he was able to hear that he was called ugly. So, our quest is clear. We gotta torch Nasty Nork and gather all the gems, all the dragon eggs, and free all the dragons that have been turned into crystallized statues. But This is where the gameplay loop really starts to kick in for Spyro the Dragon. So why don't we get involved with some good old collecting goodness now, shall we? The gameplay loop of Spyro the Dragon and the series as a whole for this classic trilogy is very solid. It's very addicting because you'll always be collecting something new within a matter of seconds. You don't really go too long without collecting anything, be it gems on the ground or within enemies, boxes, or crates, to collecting dragon eggs from pesky thieves, dragon statues from all around the dragon realms, or woodland critters dropping butterflies, which represent your health. There's a lot to go into with the gameplay of Spyro the Dragon, and it kind of relays the same to the entire series, so I'm going to be a little bit redundant when I go into this in the later reviews. But let's get into it, starting with Spyro's movesets. Spyro, as a dragon, is too young to be able to fly on his own, save inside of the speedway stages where Spyro will always constantly be flying. At most, in normal levels and inside of the home world, Spyro can only jump and glide. You jump with the X button, and you can glide at the top of a jump by hitting X again. Now, one thing that I really don't like in the first Spyro the Dragon game, and something that I really wish they would have corrected with the Reignited trilogy, is that you don't have a really good way of stopping mid-air without hitting the triangle button. In later games, you have a flutter move that allows you to flutter in place and get your bearings from wherever you're gliding from. In the first Spyro the Dragon game, hit the triangle button, you just plop like a rock straight down, and it feels very heavy and does not feel good at all. Another thing that Spyro has in his repertoire is a charge, using his horns to attack smaller enemies and break metal boxes and metal crates. Now, this is another thing that the later Spyro games would improve on, in that Spyro 1 has a weird arc movement that you end up experiencing when you are going in a charge state. And it's hard to describe in words, but it just feels wrong. And it's one thing that they would fix in later Spyro games, starting with the second game, and it becomes way more responsive to charge. And of course, what dragon doesn't have a fire breath ability? Hitting the circle button allows you to breathe fire, which allows you to destroy certain wooden crates, certain metal crates, certain gem popping crates, and bigger enemies or enemies covered in metal, as metal cannot be flamed but must be charged, save for the big enemies that have weak spots that are open to their flaming ability. Now, one thing that Spyro is also very versatile in is health. See, Spyro doesn't just take one hit and die, although he can't swim in the first Spyro the Dragon game, which is kind of a shame. That being said, in Spyro 1, you have a health meter indicated by your dragonfly companion, Sparks. Sparks glows different colors depending on how many hits you have left. Yellow meaning you have full health, blue meaning you have 2 hits left of Sparks before he disappears, green meaning 1 hit left of Sparks or 2 hits left overall, and no Sparks means you have no health, and if you get hit once, you die. Now, that might not seem bad, but Sparks is actually very versatile in that he actually picks up gems for you when you are nearby them and will draw them into you, making it that you don't have to directly go over it. You'll notice that when you don't have Sparks, the gems won't come near you and you have to run directly over them. Now, that's also not a problem, as this game doesn't have touch damage like other platformers generally do. Instead, if you end up getting hit by an enemy's attack animation, that's what will damage you, or if you fall into water or lava, because let's face it, Spyro is many things, but immune to being able to swim apparently is not one of them. Now, what about how you progress through the worlds? Well, there are a few methods on how you do it, and one of the main methods is you end up going through the worlds in a certain order based on how much you've collected in that world. Now, it starts off easy. You just have to collect a certain number of dragons inside of the homeworld and the overlaying levels that are around you. Then you have to collect gems, then dragon eggs, then more gems, then more dragons, and then you're at the end of the game. It's always good whenever you see something that would seem like an extra collectible to collect it, because you don't know if the balloonist of that world, the beings that are in charge of taking you from homeworld to homeworld, will let you on unless you have a certain amount of their criteria. You can simply just talk to them by hitting the triangle button, and they will tell you, sorry, or okay, you have enough of X collectible, so let's go to the next homeworld. And that's where it really gets into the game on how you play. If you want to go for 100%, you can. There is nothing stopping you in Spyro 1 from 100%ing each level as you go through it. In later Spyro games, you are locked off based on certain story cues, and that ties in more to the story playing more of a role in the later Spyro games. But in Spyro 1, you can just go through an entire homeworld as much as you want until you collect a certain number of prerequisites and then move on to the next homeworld. Or if you want to collect everything, you will end up being in the world longer, but by the end of the game, you'll unlock a special level known as Nasty's Loot. Nasty's Loot is a bonus world that allows you to get all the remaining treasure in the game and unlock that hidden extra ending I mentioned in the story section. Now, one thing that is very underutilized in Spyro the Dragon, and something that I actually kind of wish came back in later series, was how the live system worked. Now, you would get lives in two ways. You can either get them from statues, and these statues are little purple clamshell designs that once you end up breaking them open, reveal a Spyro silver statue. Those will instantly give you one life. But that's not the only way to get a life inside of Spyro the Dragon. The other way to get a life is to actually end up hitting all old enemies and collecting the silver orbs that they drop. Once you fill up the life counter circle around with silver orbs, you will end up getting another life. Not that lives are really that important in Spyro the Dragon. There's actually a cheat code you can use to get 99 of them right away. But lives are important enough because this game does not have auto-saving. This is one of the only Spyro the Dragon games that does not have an autosave function. Most Spyro the Dragon games autosave, starting even with the second game from the get-go. In this game, you save by stepping on a statue pedestal where a dragon you freed was. Once you've freed that dragon, there will be a fairy that pops up that allows you to save your game. And that's pretty much it for how you save your game. In later Spyro games, it's changed where you are able to save by just simply entering and exiting a world. The game autosaves automatically once you enter a world or enter a new homeworld, a boss, anything like that. And I do like the autosave function, but for the life function, they did make it easier in later games to get lives, but I'll get into that once we get into the Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage review. So that pretty much covers all of the gameplay loop of Spyro the Dragon. One thing that I do like about Spyro the Dragon, and this was pretty much indicative of a lot of early Insomniac games, is there are unique enemies in each world. Yep. Each world has its own unique set of enemies, each world has its own unique set of obstacles, and if I had to pick a favorite level in this game, besides Nasty's Loot, because it's just a fun little alternative to show how far you've come, I have to say my favorite world is North Cove. It just feels really cool seeing all the Norks all around doing the shipping. And you really get the feeling like, hey, these Norks are kind of just minding their own business. They're not really taking over the Dragon Realms, because what's stopping Nasty Nork from doing that from beforehand? Now, there are bosses in Spyro the Dragon. And these bosses get into another little section I'm going to talk about. And that is bosses as a level as opposed to bosses as an enemy fight. So in later Spyro the Dragon games, bosses are the standard type of boss you would think of. You just fight an enemy in a closed arena, and once you beat them, you can move on to the next portion of the game. In Spyro the Dragon, the bosses are the levels themselves. You have an enemy at the end of the level that you fight, but you have an entire level of which to go around in order to fight them in. So, the bosses in Spyro 1 are nothing to write home about. You'll forget most of them, no doubt. Honestly, the only two I remember off the top of my head for every time I play this game is Toasty and Jacques. Jacques being a reason that we'll get into later, but Toasty because it's just a ram on stilts with a scythe. And I find that hilarious. That being said, other enemies in the game are different in how they act. So each of the Norks, the main enemies that are littering the world, have different types of animations, different looks, different feels, and funny enough, even have different weapons and different ways to defeat them in some of their cases. Take, for example, in Dark Hollow. You have Norks where you have metal shields, which only can be defeated by charging. Then you have big Norks, which can only be flame, that have wooden shields. Then you have big Norks that have metal shields on everywhere except their backside, so once you flame them, they will end up dying. And it's always interesting to see when games do unique enemies for world, because it takes a lot to do that, and it's something that later Spyro and even later Ratchet and Clank games would stop after the third game because it just takes too much time, especially given the fact that the development time between each of the Spyro games and each of the Ratchet and Clank games was about a year, give or take, between each of the main entries by Insomniac Games. So time was of the essence, and I'm not surprised that they cut down on it, but it's still very interesting when you have games that have different enemies throughout their entire gameplay. But gameplay is probably one of the things that I care about the most in the Spyro the Dragon series. But if I had to say anything that many people are very much aware of in the Spyro the Dragon series, it's the music. So why don't we get into the music by a legendary composer and police drummer, Stuart Copeland. So yes, I wasn't lying of who the composer was of these Spyro the Dragon games. Stuart Copeland, former drummer of the Police and composer of Spyro 1, 2, 3, and Spyro 4 Enter the Dragonfly, would work on all the games and would have a rather interesting way of developing music for the Spyro the Dragon series, in that he would play the beta levels of the game and would design music around that. Combine the really amazing soundtrack with my favorite tracks being Dark Hollow, Nork Cove, and Jacques, because Jacques is just a really good track. It's also one of Stuart Copeland's favorite tracks, with the regular sound design, which nothing is overpowering, nothing overbears the ears, and everything sounds pleasant whenever you're playing Spyro the Dragon. Everything has a strong reaction based on when you jump, glide, spit fire, charge, break items, beat enemies, and everything in between. It all balances together to form a very good cohesion. Same with the voice acting, actually, because remember, this is Universal Interactive we're talking about, so of course there's going to be voice acting, generally from people within the voice acting industry. Voicing Spyro in this game, we have the talented Carlos Alazraqui, not the person who would go on to voice Spyro in later entries, as later entries of the series would be voiced by Tom Kenny, and the Reignited trilogy opting all 3 of the first Spyro games being voiced by Tom Kenny as well. Carlos Alazraqui is a name that many might not immediately recognize, but if I were to say probably one of the most well-known roles I would think of when I think of Carlos Alazraqui, it's Rocco from Rocco's Modern Life. Yeah, it's Rocco, voicing a dragon. Ain't that just grand? Now, Carlos Alazraqui isn't the only one who's voiced inside of Spyro the Dragon, but he's one of the main ones who's credited because of the fact that, you know, Carlos Alazraqui is a big top billing name. You also have Michael Goh voicing Nasty Nork and Clancy Brown voicing some of the dragons within the game, along with Jamie Alcroft and Michael Connor. We have a lot of dragons that will share the same voice actors because there are over 70 of them, and most of the time it just amounts to "thank you for releasing me" being said by whichever voice actor they decided to roll in for that one. That being said, we do have a lot of really good performances for the dragons that aren't just saying "thank you for releasing me." Even some of them trying to hint at little lore dumps here and there that don't really pan out to anything, but they're rather nice. Plus, hey, we get a nice little Parappa the Rappa reference with Carlos Alazraqui.
Wow, I never thought I'd be rescued, especially by such a little dragon. What I mean is, I always believed in you, Spyro.
You gotta believe!
So overall, the sound design of Spyro the Dragon and the series as a whole is very solid. While I won't talk about the sound design too much in later reviews, I do want to have this be a stepping off point in that it's really good. Just no hold bar, very solid. So overall, what are my thoughts on Spyro the Dragon? Spyro 1 is a good stepping off point for a series, and it's a very solid first attempt entry. As I will get into with Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage, it still had a lot of growing to do, but it's one of those games where it's necessary to develop a groundwork and then refine it in the sequels, which I find that Ripto's Rage and Year of the Dragon do flawlessly. Well, I still have my gripes with both of those games, but we'll get into that once we get into those reviews. Now, how can you play Spyro the Dragon nowadays? Well, there's no shortage of ways to play it thanks to the Spyro Reignited trilogy released back in 2018. The Spyro the Dragon series has seen a bit of a revival thanks to that, although nothing has been done with the series just yet. I'm hoping at some point we get a proper Spyro 4 that's not Enter the Dragonfly, and continues the game series forward with new ideas and new mechanics. But we'll get more into that once we end up getting into the Spyro Year of the Dragon review. Overall, Spyro the Dragon, very solid game that I highly recommend playing. You can still play the PS1 original, I believe, on the PlayStation 3. I don't know how much longer the PlayStation 3 store is going to be open, if it's even still open at all. But other than that, besides having an original PlayStation 1 copy, another way to play the game is primarily the Reignited trilogy, which for many, they would say that the Reignited trilogy is the best way to play Spyro the Dragon because of the fact that it's got a huge graphical update. It's readily available on every system and every platform. And it remasters most of the game originally on how it was designed, for better and for worse. So overall, Spyro the Dragon is a very solid game that I highly recommend people try out over time. This channel has a very deep-rooted love for Spyro the Dragon, seeing as it was the first ever Let's Play I ever did. It's a game that I always loved to play, and while it's not my favorite of the original trilogy, it's still a very solid game. But anyway, everyone, I'm gonna end it off right here. This has been Neronium, and stay tuned in the future for the next review of Spyro 2, Ripto's Rage, otherwise known as Gateway to Glimmer if you live in Europe. Until then, I'll see you all next time.